Ladies and gentlemen, I guess we can slowly start. My name is Paweł Kaczmarczyk. I'm director of the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw, and I have privilege to chair the session. We are starting right now. And let me just start with a few words of introduction. In recent years, we experienced a series of crises related to migration. In 2015, we had something called refugee crisis, in fact, being crisis of European institutions. Then we had a pandemic as a key challenge for mobilities across the globe. But still, what we're experiencing right now is, as we often say, extraordinary. And this is at least for three reasons. First of all, is because of the scale of the phenomenon we are facing, as shown, for example, by the UNHCR data. In the case of country I come from, in the case of Poland, we already recorded over 4.5 million border crossings, and still around 1.5 million Ukrainians are staying in the country. Second, it's because of the geography. Most people fleeing the war zone in Ukraine, they move to neighboring countries, but being also EU member states. And third, because of special measures introduced in the European Union, being temporary protection schemes, and also allowing people to work and to be mobile within and outside the European Union. Any of those measures have produced a very unique mobility pattern. And in fact, they can be also treated as a particular test for European asylum system. So as for now, we are aware that free and safe Ukraine is a key to the future of Europe. We all know what are the needs in terms of support and help, but we also are aware that what we need is just rigorous and methodologically well prepared research on migration. And what is important is just to exchange of information on what is happening right now in Ukraine and also in other countries. And this is why a few weeks ago, we initiated a platform that's being called Research Network on Ukrainian Migration. We initiated it three institutions, Migration Policy Center and the European University Institute here in Florence, then Maastricht University and University of Warsaw, being represented by Center of Migration Research. So the idea is just to have a flexible platform for sharing information and doing good research in the future. So we are open for expansion in the future. And first of all, we would be happy to include Ukrainian institutions in the network soon. So stay tuned and more information will follow. And right now, I'm extremely happy that we have the opportunity to initiate work of our network by presenting very recent outcomes of study completed by Migration Policy Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce Lenka Dražanová, who will just discuss the case of recent attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees and also the responses of European governments to what is happening right now. The idea of the seminar is very simple. Lenka will have around 30 minutes for presenting the results, and then we'll have still around 20 minutes for discussion. Please be aware, to those of you who are following us online, we are in full hybrid mode. So we have also participants here in the room. So we'll just gather questions from both the room here, and also please free to post your questions on the chat. Lenka, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paweł, for this introduction. So indeed, just to give you a little bit of context, but I think it's not that much necessary. More than 5 million people have now been displaced by the war in Ukraine, mostly into the neighboring countries, but also in other European countries. And this, for instance, in comparison, when Syrian displacement took place to reach this number of 5 million, it took 6 years. And also most of the Syrian refugees are actually placed in just 70% of them are placed in just 2 European countries, namely Germany and Sweden. So therefore now we are actually experiencing a very unprecedented wave of refugees from Ukraine into Europe. Since World War II, there has never been such a high number of refugees in such a short time. Of course, migration has been one of the most divisive policy issues in Europe for recent years. Since 2015, the topic of refugee and asylum seekers and immigration in general has been one of the key salient issues in public debates. On the other hand, in 2015, asylum applications have been mainly concentrated in a few destination countries, such as Germany, Austria, or Sweden, as I have just mentioned. Whereas now in 2022, there is a rapid and largely unpredicted rise in Ukrainian refugees, also in so-called non-traditional destination countries, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, and so on and so forth. So what we know from previous rounds of data, we have collected in social science research, for instance, from the European Social Survey. In 2018, many of the neighboring countries to Ukraine are among the most non-welcoming EU members to immigrants. Here you can see that they are basically at the top of the most unwelcoming countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and this is valid for both welcoming people from the same race and ethnicity, and the numbers are even worse for people from different races and ethnicities. Now, a few weeks ago, there has been a pre-release of the European Social Survey, and data was collected in 2020 or 2021, so again, before the Ukraine crisis. And even this data confirms that. Unfortunately, the pre-release of data is just about few countries, so the countries that regard the neighbors or very close countries to Ukraine is Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. But again, the numbers are pretty similar to the ones we have from the 2018, when almost a third of the population would allow none of the immigrants of the same race, and even in Czech Republic we see even 40% would not allow none of the people of different races to come to their country. The trends in anti-refugees attitudes in Europe are not unique to Central and Eastern European countries. Here, this is from a paper by Christian Cimara, when people were asked whether the government should be generous in judging people's application for refugee status. And you can see that so higher numbers actually mean, on the y-axis, mean more anti-refugee attitudes. And you can see that in most of European countries, the anti-refugee attitudes were growing since 2014 till 2017. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine shows that there is an increase in public, or it appears there is an increase in public openness to people fleeing war or oppression. It appears that countries across Europe have warmly welcomed refugees from the war in Ukraine, and even politicians that have been known for their anti-migration views are now calling for support for those fleeing the conflict. So, for instance, we have seen Matteo Salvini, the leader of the Italian anti-immigration party, flying to Poland in showing support for the Ukrainian refugees. We have even heard Viktor Orban, who called the previous waves of Syrian refugees an anti-Muslim Muslim invasion into Europe, now claiming that all refugees from Ukraine will be welcomed in Hungary. So we are actually observing quite a different reaction across Europe that we have seen in previous years. So based on all this, we have actually commissioned an original survey by the MPC regarding attitudes to Ukrainian refugees. We have surveyed online respondents in 8 EU countries, namely in Poland, Germany, Czechia, Italy, Romania, Slovakia, Austria, and Hungary. The survey was conducted on a nationally representative sample of around 1,000 respondents in each country. And in total, we have had 8,525 respondents that were interviewed between May 25th and June 6th in 2022, so very recently. And we asked all the respondents questions about Ukrainian refugees, what they think about the government responses to Ukrainian refugees, questions about hosting refugees, and general immigration attitudes towards immigrants in general. So here are the first results. What will I be presenting today are very basic results, mostly descriptive and explorative. And of course, we have planned to also allow for some more causal claims later in an academic study. So as you see here, actually attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees are quite welcoming, even in countries traditionally seen as anti-immigrant or anti-refugee, such as Slovakia or Hungary. Even here, only around 10% of people would allow none of the Ukrainian refugees to come in the country. The rest is quite welcoming, although what you can also see that, for example, in Germany, there is a quite high number of people who would allow many Ukrainian refugees, but in most countries, people would like to see some sort of control of the government around refugees. So contrast this with the pre-release of the ESS data that I just mentioned, when people in the same countries would actually, so here we see that it would be around 30% of people that would allow none of the refugees. So what is happening here? So what we also wanted to see is whether this is really a unique response to Ukrainian refugees compared to other types of refugees. So we conducted what is called in social sciences a survey experiment, when we actually randomly allocated respondents to two groups of approximately equal size and presented each group with one of two versions of a survey question. In this way, when we conduct a survey experiment, what this means is that the differences across the conditions cannot be accounted by individual level differences, because as respondents are randomly selected, the two groups do not differ in anything else than just the question that are being asked. And here are the two questions. So one group, which was around half of the sample, was asked whether they would allow more or less Ukrainian refugees to come and live in the country, whereas the other half was asked about Syrian refugees. And here are the results for Syrian refugees. So as you see, again, we see numbers that are quite similar to the ones from last year's, that were collected by the European Social Survey, when in Czech Republic, around 30% would allow none of the refugees to come to the country, Slovakia, the same, Hungary. So these numbers reflect quite a lot what we have seen in recent years. And especially that Central and Eastern Europeans are not very welcoming to refugees in general. So here you can contrast the two figures completely. So you see that there is a strike difference between the two, and the acceptance of Ukrainians versus Syrians. And this cannot be accounted by any other individual differences in the respondents than just the target group. So whether they are actually asked about Ukrainians or about Syrians. This confirms previous finding in academic research that, what this survey allows us to do was also an opportunity to test the validity of the in-group favoritism in explaining public attitudes towards immigration or refugees in Western and Eastern European context. What this shows is that participants in this survey experiment in all European countries generally favor Ukrainians over Syrians. However, the difference is much more pronounced in Central and Eastern Europe. This confirms the research that found that in the European context, attitudes towards immigrants vary across groups, being more negative toward ethnic minorities, and the opposition is especially pronounced in the case of Muslims and Roma. The anti-immigration sentiment should be understood within a multidimensional framework along multiple sources that vary across the different groups of immigrants. So this is just a confirmation that it kind of depends who the refugees are. This is what we see from our survey as well. Moving on, on the other hand, we also ask how the respondents in each country are satisfied with the government action towards Ukrainian refugees. We see that generally most respondents are satisfied with the government actions. Only in Czech Republic and Slovakia, there's a below average satisfaction with the government action. Why is this question important? Because the level of satisfaction with government is crucial. As we've seen in 2015, it was the failure of governments to respond effectively to the crisis of displacement that led to the political and institutional crisis with a breakdown in European cooperation. When we asked about the government satisfaction, we actually asked specifically about refugees from Ukraine. So it can be difficult to disentangle from more general levels of satisfaction with the government in each country, of course. And on the other hand, that's why we were interested to also see who is more satisfied with government actions. And we see that in each country, it is actually people who would allow more Ukrainian refugees are the same ones that are more satisfied with the government actions. So on the other hand, this shows that the levels of satisfaction are far from overwhelming with potential fragility. Basically, if the government changes their course of action, the levels of satisfaction can also change, of course. The direction of causality is difficult to disentangle, but if supports fades, then levels of satisfaction in government would also be likely to fall. So we can expect that. We also ask respondents whether to what extent do they think their country has a duty to Ukrainian refugees. As you can see in Central and Eastern Europe, the majorities do not feel their country has any duty at all or not much duty. This is very much in contrast to Austria, Italy, and Germany, where the majorities feel that their country has somewhat a duty towards Ukrainian refugees or Ukraine. We don't have an answer to this yet, but one question that comes into mind is whether this is also related how the respondents see their country as an international player. So whether respondents, for example, in Romania and the Czech Republic believe that their country has not much say into what Europe could do about Ukraine and how much they feel their government has a say in political affairs in general. What is somewhat surprising here is that the majority of Hungarians feel they have somewhat or extreme duty towards Ukraine. So this is an interesting finding, I believe, which stands somehow in contrast to respondents in the other Central and Eastern European countries. The next question we also asked was about the treatment of Ukrainian refugees. So what we know from social science research that responses to migration are powerfully driven by perceptions of fairness. And so as we see from the figure on the left, more than half of German respondents think that their government treats Ukrainian refugees worse than themselves. On the other hand, more than half of Slovakian respondents think that their government treats Ukrainian refugees better than themselves. Of course, again, causality can be difficult to disentangle here. We also do not know yet how much this is actually reflected in the real actions of the government. So for instance, we do know that in many of the countries like Czech Republic or Slovakia, Ukrainian refugees in fact enjoy free public transport and some other things from the government. So this might also kind of lead for why respondents in these countries believe that the government treats them better. On the other hand, irrespective of the objective, better or worse treatment, subjective perception of fairness and unfairness can have a very powerful effect on attitudes towards refugees. So this is why we thought this question is also important. We finally also ask respondents whether they have been hosting or are planning to host Ukrainian refugees. I must admit I was a little bit surprised by the low numbers that responded that they have hosted or are hosting or are willing and able to host. So clear majorities of citizens in Hungary and Czech and Slovakia are not willing to host Ukrainian refugees, in fact. In all other countries, the majority has either hosted, although it's a very small number, would be willing to host or would at least like to, but it's unable to. And the small proportion of people in each country who have either hosted or are willing and able to host suggests a necessity for governmental responses to address the current situation, rather than relying on private initiatives by citizens. So to conclude from these initial numbers we have received, so good policy responses to displacement from Ukraine also require an informed understanding of citizens' attitudes. There is a strong support for Ukrainian refugees that exceeds that for other refugees groups, but with a preference that numbers be regulated or controlled. There's a main difference from previous crises, such as the one in 2015. The main difference is that the government and the media responses are very different from what we have seen previously, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a general satisfaction so far with the government responses, but we also detected an underlying fragility linked to people's need to see that the situation is properly managed. And the risk is that the crisis of displacement can turn into political and institutional crisis. And finally, if the conflict persists and mass displacement becomes a long-term issue, people will want to know that there's a plan and that it's being implemented. So these are our conclusions, and our next steps would be actually, so as we have seen, framing the issue in a positive and empathetic manner through media channels, speeches of politicians and public figures might be helpful in building social cohesion in societies, but we might also ask how stable is of an effect this can have. And for this reason, we also would like to actually repeat our surveys later in time to see how attitudes are changing, based on also how government responses are changing and so on and so forth. We would also like to study whether the sources of opposition towards refugees from different groups are also different. So is it just about racism? Is it actually about something else? Is it about the, for instance, the Russian threat? So for example, one of the hypotheses we are working with is whether the positive attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees in Central and Eastern Europe is driven by empathy due to Russia being the perpetrator, as many people in these countries have experienced somehow a similar destiny, such as the Soviet tanks in Hungary in 1956 or in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and so on and so forth. And we also would like to see whether the feeling of a European identity in these countries and kind of seeing Ukrainians more close to the European identity explains these differences from other attitudes, for example, towards Syrians. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much. We have more time for discussion, even around 30 minutes. So we'll just start soon. Let me start with one comment, not a question, because probably the most puzzling issue is the attitudes and the behavior in Central and East European countries. And for me, it's not very easy to disentangle because, in fact, what we observe there is just a complex interaction of many features. So on the one hand, these are the so-called new immigrant destinations with substantially underdeveloped immigrant-related institutions, including, for example, integration. Second, we have the case of spatial and also cultural proximity, as you emphasized a lot. And at the same time, however, we have very let's say, radical governments in many of those countries who've been just investing a lot in anti-immigrant rhetoric over the past few years. So in my opinion, we have several factors here, and it's not that very easy at this stage to disentangle what are the most important ones. But I'm sure we'll just go back to this in a discussion soon. So the floor is open. We can start with questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Omar Moussali. I am from Djibouti. Thank you very much for the presentation. In the figures that you presented, there were like Germany, Hungary, there was a group of people, but within these groups, do you have any indications that there might be differences between different categories of people by different socio-demographic or economic characteristics? Like for example, at the beginning of the summer school, when we saw the attitudes, we said that whether you have a young person, or, I mean, the attitudes also are related to socioeconomic, socio-demographic backgrounds. So do you have any information, in-depth information about how different groups might vary their attitudes towards the refugees? Merci.
Maybe I would suggest collecting a few more questions, if there are any.
Yes, so I'm Marloes and I'm doing my research on ethnic discrimination education. I had a question. You talked about that the attitudes changed also due to the media. And I was wondering how you measured the effect of the media influence on the attitudes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Walid. I'm from Iraq. I have just one question. I think you have been mentioned like 70% of the Syrian refugee targeting either Germany or Sweden. So could you please elaborate why these two countries have been targeted by this Syrian refugee? Thank you.
So maybe I would suggest we start with responding to those three questions and then we'll open the floor again. So Lenka, floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavel. So regarding the sociodemographics, we did collect the data. We have it for this presentation today. It would to disentangle this in each country, because we might also see different sociodemographics playing a little bit differently in each country, for instance. And we discussed this previously at the migration summer school. Education usually has a big effect in Western Europe, but much lower effects in Central and Eastern Europe. In some countries, actually, the higher educated are not more welcoming to refugees. So we would need to disentangle this country by country. So this is again the next step to do, and I'm very much looking forward to elaborate on this. But for today, I don't have much information regarding this, to be honest. The media framing, so we actually did two things. So what I presented today, what I meant was mostly what kind of an observational study of me coming from the region and seeing the reaction, for example, in the of the Czech newspapers and the Czech government. There is a strike difference. You can see Ukrainian flags on all government buildings in Prague. When I went there, I was somehow surprised, because in Italy, in Florence, I do not see so many Ukrainian flags. I mostly see peace flags. So there's also a contrast, I would say. And but we did actually in the survey ask people also how often they read me or they listen to media, TV or newspapers daily. So that's also one of our future explanatory variables, looking how differences in attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees might be related to the media consumption of these respondents. So we might know more. But here I was mostly referring to how we in the general newspapers, we do not see such an anti-refugee rhetoric that we have seen in the previous wave. And finally, with the Syrian, so 70% of Syrian refugees actually living in Europe. So of course, most of Syrian displaced refugees are, for example, in Turkey, but within Europe, which is, I believe, around 1 million in total, I think, Syrians. So 70% of those are in Germany and Sweden mostly. And I think there are, of course, many reasons for that. First of all, the general welcoming attitude of the government during the previous years. So, of course, might influence the destination country of a refugee. Also family reunification, which is one of the main drivers of actually in the EU in general of migration is family reunification. So we don't often talk about that. And I think there is a series of motives why the refugees go there, but this is not a question for about public attitudes there. Of course, it might play a role, but I believe refugees do not choose their destination country strictly based on public attitudes towards themselves. So it's a lot of factors together, I would say.
But in fact, that was a super interesting point, and this is what we've been discussing already here today. Maybe let us turn to our online participants, as we have already several questions been put on the chat. Let's start with a question posted by Kerry Hartman, and the question is, if you have looked into cover rates yet, and if there is any sense of whether the same or different cover rates may predict attitudes in different countries. The same question, the next question has been posted by Natalia Letki. As you said, comparing Syrian and Ukrainian refugees shows a clear preference for the latter, but this could be explained by a number of factors and not just cultural distance. For example, the immediacy of the war in Ukraine and its heavy media presence are likely to impact the perceptions of Ukrainian immigrants as more needy. These two issues are also likely to affect questions about obligations towards Ukrainian refugees. So it's more comment, but feel free also to comment on that. And the next point raised by Kerry Hartman, what about compassion fatigue to explain the difference between Syrian and Ukrainian refugees? Would be interesting to look at attitudes towards Syrians in 2015 compared to Ukrainians in 2022. So let's start with this three and then we'll continue.
Great question. So I think I answered a little bit the socio-demographic questions. I did not have a look at the data that we have at hand right now, but I indeed would expect that it is different covariates that explain attitudes in different countries. So there might be a prevalence, for example, of education having a positive effect in Italy or in Germany, and much lower effect in, let's say, Czech Republic or Hungary. Of course, this is my assumption. I cannot speak. I don't have the data in front of me yet, but this would be something I would expect. To Natalia's question. So first of all, yes, I agree. There's the immediacy of the war, but what surprise and the media presents, of course, but as I said, also from what I know from Natalia's research, that you also have found that, for example, in Poland, attitudes actually did not change, in fact. So what is changing is indeed the media framing and the government response to the war in Ukraine, which is very different from the one with the Syrian war. But the attitudes of people actually stay quite stable. And at least from what I understood from the research, because they surveyed Polish, maybe also other countries, right?
Four countries.
Yeah, 4 countries, and they surveyed them in January and in May, and they did not change much also with the Russian invasion. On the other hand, I agree completely that it is not just about the cultural distance between Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees. There might be other things into play, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, because what we have seen, the difference between Ukrainian and Syrian refugees, for example, in Germany and Italy, is not that striking. I mean, there is some preference for Ukrainian refugees also in these countries as well, but in Central and Eastern Europe is much higher. And what I believe might be the cause is, first of all, the quite gendered immigration. So who is coming from Ukraine is mostly women and children. So for instance, the argument very often used previously against Syrians is young men that might be a threat to our society cannot be used in this instance. Of course, there is the Russian perpetration and the Russian invasion, and these countries are very much sensible, not for one reason, they're much more geographically closer, but also, as I mentioned previously, because of history and historic memory. Also, for instance, although Russia was present even or is present in the Syrian war, here it seems much easier for people to understand who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, whereas in the Syrian war, it was not as clear who is at fault and what is happening. So many people did not, at a certain point, understand who should be the victim in that conflict. And so it's a number of things, and I indeed very often we hear we read and hear commentaries that say, oh, it's just about race, it's just about white supremacy, all these people in Central and Eastern Europe are racist, and this is why now they are welcoming Ukrainians, but they have not been welcoming Syrians. Of course, racism might play a role here, but this is not unique to Central and Eastern Europe at all, actually. So there is research showing that, of course, attitudes towards immigration might be explained to a certain extent by racism, but my argument would be that it's not the whole story. So there is a lot of other factors that we might take into consideration and why we see such a different reaction.
Compassion fatigue.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I have heard already arguments that this is what is happening. I'm not sure yet, but I think it is very much possible as years pass. And of course, Ukrainian refugees, if the war will continue and years will be passed, then this compassion fatigue, even in these countries that now appear very welcoming, might kind of be happening. And also with when people will realize that refugees are here to stay and they need to integrate, and of course this might lead to other problems that are now already by some far-right parties already seeing, oh, there Ukrainian children are taking spaces at kindergarten, what will we do, and so on and so forth. So this might be happening in the future, and that's why we want to repeat these surveys.
Thank you. Maybe I will just continue with a comment posted by Saya Torunchik, and I will add mine as well. What Saya wrote is just in relation to Natalia's comment that about possible factors of attitudes towards Ukrainian and Syrian refugees, for example, in Poland, could be just a case of direct contact with immigrants. Most people in Central and Eastern Europe, they have had contact with Ukrainian migrants, but not with Syrian refugees. So she wonders if direct contact with Ukrainians or Syrian migrants, refugees has been measured in the survey. So this is a question, in fact. And I would just add to this one point, because I guess what matters in the context is also the language. And you also somehow touch upon the issue. And just to refer briefly to the Polish case, you know, we commonly use the term refugees with regard to Ukrainians, even if they are not refugees. They are not asylum seekers because most of them, they have not started the procedure. So for example, for analytical purposes, we are calling them war refugees, just to distinguish from convention-based refugees. However, with regard, for example, to Syrians or even those people who are just trying to get into the Polish territory via Belarusian border, Polish government would never use the word refugee. These people are being labeled labor migrants or just migrants, and the same case was Syrian refugees from 2015. So as for me, among the complexity of factors mentioned, language plays also quite important role. Would you like to respond to Saya's comments, or we move to next points?
So just very briefly, so we did not measure contact with Ukrainians versus Syrians, also because in many countries, such as I can speak for the Czech Republic, there will be virtually no contact with Syrian refugees because there are none. So it wasn't a question. And with the language, I agree, but also I just very briefly, I have seen the problem that a lot of Ukrainians actually do speak Russian as their primary language. And so it becomes, on the other hand, very difficult for Czechs to disentangle whether it is actually Ukrainians or Russians when they hear Russian in the public transport. So we have had these cases when no one is certain actually who is who. And this comes to some problems as well. But
so I would suggest moving back to the chat and if there will be any questions here in the room afterwards, so we'll have another round, okay? So there is a methodological question asked by Sabina Sirokowska. The question is, how did you quantify some and many in the survey, if that was the case? Then there's a question by Arnaud de Boucouy. Did the study investigate the reason behind satisfaction with government action? Where respondent asked to specify which types of measures they approve of and which not. There is the next point raised by Kerry Hartman. Do you have a quite pragmatic one? Do you have plans to make the data publicly available to outside researchers, and what would be the timeline? So it's quite important point. Yeah, so these are the questions posted on chat.
yes, so when they were asked about some and many, there were no numbers specified. So respondents were just asked, would you allow Ukrainian refugees to come and live into this country? And you could choose between 4 responses: allow some, allow none, allow few, and allow many. So, but it wasn't specified. It was a very subjective measure of how many that is for each respondent. But this is a standard questions we usually use in surveys, because of course then for especially in cross countries comparisons, this would be very problematic to use specific numbers, because if you have a country like Germany, which is big, and a very small country like Slovakia, then of course the proportion plays a role. The reason, no, we did not investigate the reasons behind the satisfaction in the sense what were the exact measures they liked. We assume that most of these governments have been welcoming. And what we saw indeed was that people who are actually pro-Ukrainian refugees coming to live in the country are those most satisfied. So this was it. And the practical question, indeed, we actually do intend to make the data available for other researchers to use them. Not yet, though, because we want to have the first look at it. And of course, we also need pragmatically, we need to clean the data and make it usable to other researchers. And once this is done, I think it's a question of a few weeks, maximum month, and then the data will be available indeed.
I would add maybe something to this point and the previous one. What we are looking with right now is just process in the making. So we all are also under pressure. So what we're discussing right now, these are very fresh results, in fact. And what follows from the discussion, also the comments, that we definitely would need to have more in-depth analysis, including qualitative studies, looking at motivation of people. So just go behind what we see in very basic, in fact, responses we got in our surveys. I would suggest to open the final round. So if you have questions, time is now.
Yes, hi, my name is Lauren. So I was just wondering about the status of Ukrainians. So most Ukrainians have not been recognized as refugees. So they have been given protection under the temporary protection directive. So this means that they are mobile, right? Because refugee status ties them to a specific country where they are receiving asylum. So do you think that there is a relationship then between that and the perception by Central and Eastern European countries that their presence there is temporary? because then they can move onward to higher income countries, or they can return to Ukraine. And do you think that this then affects the public attitudes towards the presence of Ukrainians in their territories?
I see no other questions, or maybe add 2 or 3 from my side, and I will just follow on what has been just said, because there's additional argument related to the question, because people who arrive from Ukraine, they can not only be mobile, they can also work. And in the case of Poland, for example, and this heavily emphasized by Polish government, okay, we have more questions. In case of Poland, it's heavily emphasized by Polish government that around 30 or even 40% of those female migrants who arrive to Poland, they are working. So this is the additional argument, not only temporary stay, but also, let's say, useful stay in terms of work. We have more questions, so.
Sorry, this is just sort of a follow-up to what Lauren just asked. I was wondering if what your analysis would be of the refugee regime in general, and how the Syrian crisis might have affected the questions surrounding the European Union, the Dublin mechanism, and the burden on southern European states, which is something that is completely not really being addressed in the case of the Ukrainian crisis, and linked to definitely to the denomination between refugees and temporary protection. So yeah, wondering what your analysis would be on that.
More questions? So maybe I'll just add final point from my side, and then floor is yours, and maybe 2 points. The one is the puzzle you presented at some point, and is the question of private support. And there is a recent, I guess, still not published study in Poland showing that around 800,000 of Ukrainians, they found shelter in private homes. So this number looks really impressive, but we should consider 2 issues here. So first one being that more than half of these people, they found shelters in place of other Ukrainians. So the presence of large Ukrainian diaspora, not only in Poland, but also in other countries, is one of the factors that also explain some of the puzzles we face here. And second, according to the study done among inhabitants of large Polish cities, only 4% of Polish people provided direct help in terms of providing shelter. So I have no idea if it's a large or small number, but it's just 4%. And the very last point, the question is to what extent the support system we have is sustainable. And I guess it's maybe the most critical question right now. And it will be even more difficult, for example, in September, when Ukrainian children will probably try to join Polish schools. In the case of Poland, and this information for all of you, around 50% of those people who arrived to Poland, they are females, and 50% they are children. So there's just enormous pressure on Polish schooling system, particularly in cities. And there's also enormous pressure in terms of public goods. Just to give you a clue, in the case of several Polish cities, the population of those cities increased by 30–40% just within a few weeks. So what we observe right now, just enormous eruption of solidarity and empathy, but I can easily imagine that it can turn not only in the compassion fatigue, but also into negative attitudes towards migrants, simply as a result of competition for scarce resources. This is what happens very often. Lenka, so floor is yours for final comments.
Yes, thank you. So to be completely honest with you, I don't have the data, but I do believe that in most of these countries, Central Eastern European countries, I think people believe that the Ukrainians are there to stay and not to go to higher income countries, also because there are large diasporas, as Pavel just mentioned. And for instance, in the Czech Republic, it is the largest minority have been Ukrainians for years now. And so I believe that people do not think that they would continue to Germany, for instance, and so which was very often the argument, for example, with Syrian refugees, when the official argument also by the government have been, why would you relocate them here? Because they are not going to stay anyway, so it's a waste of everyone's time, because then they want to go to Germany. So this argument we do not hear now with Ukrainians, neither from the government, but nor from the media, for instance. So I would not, the only expectation might be that they would go back to Ukraine. But it's very uncertain when this will happen, as we don't know, of course, how things will continue. There are documented crossings back to Ukraine, quite large ones, honestly, but still, we of course don't know how things will develop in the next month or years. But in general, I think people expect them to stay for a while. And as Pavel just mentioned, this will, of course, be a little bit problematic. And I have heard this argument again. We don't have, and this is actually true, there are not enough places in kindergartens and school there have not been for years enough places in kindergartens and school even before. And now with, of course, this quite large amount of new children in a very short time, this will create some problems for government and for the state institutions to incorporate them. On the other hand, we know, of course, from research that this is one of the key factors if we want to support social cohesion in the future, that for right integration, we need to integrate these people into the general country's institutions, and kind of this help their integration into the labor market and schools is crucial, quite frankly, so that this can somehow not lead to any spike in anti-refugees or anti-immigration sentiments in future years.
The answer?
Yeah.
So let's assume all questions have been answered. So I guess Lenka will give you a big applause. So big thanks to all participants here on site and to our online participants. As I said, this is just a starting point. We'll stay in touch. We'll just inform you about the further steps of our initiative, as this is what's really important, I guess, for Europe, and not only for Europe right now. So many thanks.
Thank you, everyone.